The complete guide to unshakable discipline and focus. The house that kept falling. There was a period in my life when I couldn't finish anything. Not because I lacked intelligence. Not because the work was too hard. Not because the goals weren't clear enough or ambitious enough or written down in the right journal with the right colored ink. I failed to finish things because my mind was a construction site with no architect. There were walls going up everywhere. None of them connected. None of them held weight. Every morning I would show up to the site with energy and intention, and by noon I was standing in the rubble of the last thing I had started, already distracted by something new, something shinier, something that felt more urgent even though nothing was actually urgent. I was 31 years old and I had 17 open browser tabs at all times. I had 3 notebooks with the same ideas written in slightly different ways. I had a gym membership, a meditation app, a financial planning spreadsheet, and a reading list that stretched longer than my actual bookshelf. I had a business that needed my full attention and a mind that gave nothing full attention. I had ambition so large it embarrassed me when I talked about it, and results so small they embarrassed me when I looked at them. The gap between what I wanted to build and what I was actually building was not a gap at all. It was a canyon. The story of how I got to that canyon and how I eventually built a bridge. Across it is not a story about motivation. It is not a story about morning routines or productivity hacks or the right app or the right system. Those things exist in the story, but they are not what the story is about. This story is about architecture, about the understanding that a focused, disciplined mind is not something you are born with. It is something you build, deliberately, structurally, with an understanding of materials, weight-bearing walls, and the laws of the environment in which you are building. When I was a kid, my father was a contractor, not the kind who sits in an office and reviews blueprints, the kind who shows up at 6 in the morning with his hands and his tools and makes things from nothing. I spent summers on job sites watching him work. What I remember most was not the physical labor. What I remember is that he never touched a single piece of material without understanding how it connected to everything else. He could look at a wall and tell you, whether it was load-bearing or decorative, whether taking it down would collapse the ceiling or just open the room. He had a mental model of the entire structure at all times. He could hold the whole building in his head, and that is why he could work on any one piece of it without losing the whole. I did not become a contractor, but at 31, standing in the wreckage of my own attention, I began to understand that what my father had was not just knowledge of construction. It was a metaphor I needed to inhabit fully. The mind, when left alone, does not build itself into something strong and coherent. It sprawls. It accumulates material without structure. It starts walls and abandons them. It covers its weaknesses with decoration. The result is a house that looks impressive from the outside and collapses from the inside the first time real pressure is applied. This audiobook is about building that pressure-resistant structure inside yourself, about constructing a mental architecture so solid that distraction does not breach it, that failure does not flatten it, that exhaustion does not erode it, about becoming, in the most literal sense, the architect of your own attention. The work is real. It requires understanding some things about how your brain actually functions that may challenge ideas you have held for years. It requires a willingness to examine not just your habits, but your identity, because the deepest truth I have learned in this work is that how you manage your attention is not a productivity problem. It is an identity problem. And identity problems do not respond to app subscriptions. By the time we reach the end of this journey together, you will not have a new to-do list. You will have a new relationship with your own mind, a structural understanding of what focus actually is, where it comes from, how it is sustained, and what is actually happening, biologically, psychologically, neurologically. When it breaks down, you will have a method, not a motivational poster, a method. But before we build anything, we need to understand what is actually standing on the site right now. We need to take an honest inventory of the rubble. That is where we begin. The myth of motivation. Let me ask you something directly. How many times have you waited to feel motivated before starting something important? If you are honest with yourself, really honest, the number is staggering. We wait to feel motivated to go to the gym. We wait to feel motivated to start the project. We wait to feel motivated to have the difficult conversation, to write the first page, to make the phone call, to sit down and do the work that we know matters. We live inside a quiet agreement with ourselves that says, when I feel ready, I will begin. When the feeling comes, I will act. Here is the brutal truth about that agreement. The feeling almost never comes first, or rather, it comes, but it comes after, not before. Motivation, the way most people understand it, is a lie. Not the kind of lie that was told to you with malicious intent, the kind of lie that culture tells itself, generation after generation, because it sounds better than the alternative. The alternative being this: you are never going to feel like doing the hard thing, and you need to do it anyway, not because you are broken, because that is how human motivation actually works. The neuroscience here is precise, and it is humbling. Your brain's motivational system, centered in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, does not release dopamine in anticipation of starting hard work. It releases dopamine in response to novelty, to reward, and to the anticipation of reward. This means that new things feel exciting. Things you have already done feel less exciting. Things that are hard and familiar feel least exciting of all. This is not a flaw in your character. It is a feature of your neurological architecture that evolved to keep early humans alive in an environment where novelty, often, signaled something important: food, danger, opportunity. Your brain is still running that ancient software in a world that looks nothing like the one it was designed for. The consequence is this: every time you sit down to do serious, sustained, disciplined work, the kind of work that builds a business, masters a skill, produces something meaningful, you are fighting against a neurological system that is specifically designed to pull you toward something newer, easier, and more immediately stimulating. You are not lazy. You are fighting a legitimate battle. The problem is that most people do not even know the battle is happening. They think they are failing because they lack something: willpower, drive, passion, the right morning routine. They are actually failing because they are trying to win a structural battle with motivational weapons. And motivational weapons do not work against structural problems. Think about what happens in the average person's morning. The alarm goes. Before they are fully conscious, the phone is in their hand. The first inputs to the brain are social media notifications, news headlines, email subject lines, all of them engineered by the most sophisticated attention capture systems in human history to maximize dopamine stimulation. By the time they sit down to work, their brain has already been to the casino, already consumed dozens of micro-rewards, already had its daily appetite for novelty partially satisfied by content that required nothing of them. And now they are supposed to do deep, difficult, sustained work, and they wonder why it feels impossible. This is not an accident. The attention economy, the trillion-dollar industry built on capturing and monetizing human focus, depends on your inability to do sustained, deep work. Your distraction is someone else's business model. Understanding this changes the conversation from one about personal failure to one about structural reality, and structural realities require structural solutions. But here is what is even more important to understand, because this is the part that most books about productivity get wrong. The solution is not to manufacture motivation. It is not to find your why, build your vision board, or listen to the right podcast at the right volume before you sit down to work. Those things can be useful. They are not the foundation. The foundation is something far more mechanical and far more empowering. Discipline is not a feeling. It is a structure. Let me say that again, because it is the central thesis of everything that follows. Discipline is not a feeling. It is a structure. When you understand that, truly understand it, in your bones, not just as an inspiring sentence you read once, everything changes. Because a feeling is something you wait for. A structure is something you build. Consider two people who want to start running. The first person relies on motivation, on the days when they wake up and feel energized, when the weather is right and the playlist is perfect and life seems manageable. Those days they run. The second person has built a structure. They sleep in their running clothes. Their shoes are by the door. They have a fixed time that is non-negotiable. They do not decide each morning whether they will run. The decision was made weeks ago and encoded into an environment that makes the right action the path of least resistance. On most mornings, both people feel equally reluctant, but the second person runs anyway. Not because they have more willpower, because they have less need for it. They have offloaded the decision to the structure. That offloading is the key concept. Every time you make discipline dependent on feeling motivated, you are betting that a biological system designed for survival in a primal environment will spontaneously produce the exact emotional state you need for 21st century knowledge work. You are betting your most important goals on a system that was never built for that purpose. The odds are not in your favor. The architecture of discipline begins with this recognition. You cannot trust your feelings to get the work done, not because your feelings are bad or weak, because they are designed for a different job. The prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for planning, self-control, and long-term decision-making, is the newest addition to your neurological hardware. It is powerful, but it is expensive. It consumes significant metabolic energy, and it is easily overridden by older, faster, more emotionally loaded brain systems. Every time you rely on willpower alone, you are asking the newest, most energy-hungry part of your brain to override millions of years of evolutionary programming. You will win sometimes. You will not win consistently enough to build anything that matters. What you need instead is a system that does the work before the feeling is required. A system that makes good decisions at the right time, not when you are tired and distracted and the world is pulling at you from every direction, but in moments of calm clarity, when you have the cognitive bandwidth to design intelligently. You pre-decide, you pre-commit, you build an environment that makes the disciplined action easier than the undisciplined one. And then, this is the crucial part, you stop depending on yourself to feel like doing it. The relief that comes from truly accepting this is enormous. The moment you stop blaming your lack of motivation and start building your structure, you step out of the cycle of shame and into the practice of engineering. And engineering problems are solvable. Shame spirals are not. I learned this lesson the hardest possible way. For 3 years in my early 30s, I had a business plan I believed in completely. I had the skills to execute it. I had conversations with potential clients that convinced me the market existed. What I did not have was the discipline to show up for the work when the work was not exciting. Every time the initial burst of enthusiasm faded, and it always fades, for every project, for every person, I would stall. I would generate new plans instead of executing existing ones. I would research instead of produce. I would optimize my systems instead of using them. I was, in the language I now understand, a person with motivation and no architecture. The turning point came not from a book or a mentor or a moment of inspiration. It came from exhaustion, from the particular exhaustion of being someone who works hard but produces little, from the exhaustion of watching people I considered less talented, less intelligent, and less driven than me build things I could not, because they had something I was missing. I had been misdiagnosing myself for years. I thought my problem was motivation. My problem was structure. The day I understood that distinction, truly understood it in the way that changes how you wake up in the morning, was the day the architecture began. What follows in this book is not a collection of tips. It is a blueprint. We will build the mental architecture of discipline and focus from the foundation up, beginning with the neurological reality of your brain, moving through the psychological structures that support sustained effort, and ending with an identity transformation so complete that focus ceases to be something you struggle to achieve and becomes something you simply are. But first, we need to go inside the machine. We need to understand what your brain is actually doing when you sit down to work and find, to your genuine bewilderment, that you cannot. What your brain is actually doing when you lose focus. Close your eyes for a moment and try to hold a single thought. Just one. Pick something specific. The word architecture, the image of a window, the sound of rain. Try to hold it in your mind without any other thought intruding, without your attention drifting to what you need to do today, or what that person said to you yesterday, or whether you left the stove on. Most people cannot do this for more than a few seconds. That is not a failure of attention. That is the default mode network doing exactly what it was designed to do. And understanding that network, understanding what it is, what it does, and what happens when you try to override it, is the beginning of real cognitive self-knowledge. The default mode network, or DMN, is a set of interconnected brain regions that become highly active when you are not focused on an external task. It is the network of the wandering mind. It is what is running when you are daydreaming, ruminating, planning for the future, replaying the past, thinking about yourself in relation to others. Neuroscientists used to think that this network was a sign of inefficiency, the brain idling when not in use. They now know it is one of the most metabolically active and functionally important systems in the entire brain. The DMN is not your brain resting. It is your brain doing a completely different category of work. Here is why this matters for focus. When you sit down to do concentrated work, you are asking your brain to suppress the default mode network and activate what researchers call the task-positive network, a different set of brain regions associated with focused attention, working memory, and goal-directed behavior. These two networks are, by design, in opposition to each other. When one is active, the other is suppressed. They do not cooperate. They compete. The problem is that the default mode network is powerful, ancient, and deeply habitual. It was the dominant operating mode for most of human evolution. Sitting quietly in focused concentration on a single abstract task is, from a neurological standpoint, an extraordinarily unnatural act. Your brain did not evolve for it. Your brain evolved to scan the environment, detect threats, monitor social signals, and move constantly between stimuli. Sustained, voluntary, internally directed focus is a recent invention, a cognitive achievement, not a default state. This is why concentration feels effortful in a way that distraction does not. Distraction is downstream. Focus is upstream. You are, quite literally, swimming against the current every time you sit down to do serious work. This is not metaphor. This is the operational reality of your neurological hardware. Now add to this the concept of attentional residue, coined by researcher Sophie Leroy at the University of Washington. Every time you switch tasks, or even think about another task while working on the current one, you leave what she calls residue. A portion of your cognitive resources remains anchored to the previous task, even as you move on. The more task switching that has occurred in the hours before you sit down to do deep work, the more attentional residue is cluttering your working memory. Your effective cognitive capacity is not the full capacity of your brain. It is your total capacity minus the residue of everything you have already done and every distraction you have already entertained. Think about what a typical morning looks like for someone trying to be productive. They check email at 7 a.m., leaving residue from 3 conversations they have not resolved. They scroll news for 10 minutes, leaving residue from geopolitical anxiety they cannot act on. They sit in on a quick meeting, leaving residue from a decision that was not finalized. They check social media briefly, leaving residue from a comparison that lodged itself somewhere. By 10 a.m., when they sit down to do the work that requires their full intelligence, they are operating at a significant fraction of their actual cognitive capacity, and they blame themselves for not being sharper, for not being more focused, for being, as they tell themselves in the language of self-judgment, lazy or easily distracted. They are not lazy. They are informationally poisoned. Their cognitive workspace is full before the real work has begun. This understanding changes everything about how you should design your day. The morning is not just a routine. It is a cognitive asset that can be protected or squandered before you even begin to work. The quality of your attention during your most important hours is not just a function of how well you slept. It is a function of everything that has been allowed to enter your attentional space from the moment you woke up. Every piece of information you consumed, every decision you made, every conversation you engaged, all of it either preserved your cognitive capacity or eroded it. There is another neurological concept that is essential here, and it has been significantly misunderstood in popular culture: willpower depletion. The research of Roy Baumeister and colleagues at Florida State introduced the concept of ego depletion in the late 1990s, the idea that self-control draws on a limited resource, and that resource is consumed as you exercise it throughout the day. The original research suggested that this resource was blood glucose, that the literal fuel for self-regulation was running low as you made decisions and resisted temptations. Subsequent research has complicated this picture, and some of the original findings have proven difficult to replicate under stricter conditions. But the core insight survives. Self-control is not unlimited, it is not free, and it does not operate at the same capacity across all times of day and all conditions. What the more nuanced research suggests is that the cost of self-control is not purely metabolic. It is also motivational and attentional. Every time you exercise deliberate self-regulation, resisting a distraction, persisting with a difficult task, making a careful decision, you are drawing on a system that has a finite operating budget. That budget is not unlimited, and it is not equally distributed across the day. The research on decision fatigue, the phenomenon by which the quality of decisions degrades as the number of decisions increases, shows that the judges who are consistently more lenient in their morning rulings are not more moral in the morning. They are simply less depleted. The decision-making machinery is fresher. By late afternoon, with dozens of decisions already behind them, the system takes the path of least resistance, which in a judicial context means maintaining the status quo, rather than making the cognitively expensive choice to grant a deviation. This has a direct and practical implication for how you structure your discipline. If the resource that powers deliberate self-regulation is finite and unevenly distributed across the day, then discipline is not a character trait. It is a resource management problem. And resource management problems have engineering solutions. The person who succeeds at sustained discipline is not the person who has more raw willpower. In many cases, they have less. What they have, instead, is a design that minimizes the number of times they need to call on willpower at all. They have made the important decisions in advance, during moments of high cognitive capacity, so that those decisions are already encoded in their environment and their routines. They have essentially pre-spent their willpower strategically, using it to build structures at the time of day when it is most abundant, so those structures can carry the load when it is scarce. This brings us to the concept I want you to hold through the rest of this book. The concept of cognitive capital. Your attention is a finite, replenishable resource. Every morning you wake up with a fresh supply. Every distraction, every unnecessary decision, every piece of low-value information you consume, every emotional conflict you engage with before the important work is done, all of these are withdrawals from that supply. Every boundary you enforce, every distraction you pre-eliminate, every decision you pre-commit, every environment you design to protect your attention, these are deposits. Mental architecture is the practice of managing this capital with the seriousness it deserves, because what you build with the capital of your attention is not just a business or a project or a career, it is your life. The quality of what you build is the quality of your life, and the quality of what you build is determined, more than by any other variable, by the quality of the attention you bring to the building. I want to tell you about a former colleague of mine, someone I will call Daniel, though that is not his name. Daniel was, by almost any external measure, more talented than me. He had a sharper analytical mind, a broader knowledge base, and a more natural ability to connect with people in professional settings. For the first 2 years we worked in the same orbit, I watched him with the particular mixture of admiration and envy that is the specific signature of watching someone who appears to have advantages you do not. He was the kind of person people described as effortlessly capable, and then I watched him fail. Not in a sudden, dramatic way, in the quiet, grinding way that talent without architecture always fails. His projects were brilliant in conception and mediocre in execution. He would work in bursts of intense output, followed by long stretches of distraction and disengagement. He was perpetually behind, perpetually over-promising and under-delivering, perpetually in the state I had lived in myself, convinced that the next burst of motivation would finally be the one that carried him through. It was not a motivation problem. It was a brain problem. It was the problem of a person who had never learned to manage his neurological hardware, who relied on inspiration because he had never been taught that inspiration is not a system, who spent his cognitive capital as quickly as it arrived without ever investing it in structures that could grow and compound. Last I heard, Daniel had started his 4th company. The first 3 had not made it past the planning stage. I am not telling you this to be harsh about someone else's struggle. I am telling you because Daniel's story is the story of every person who is bright enough to know what they should do, motivated enough to want it intensely and architecturally unprepared to sustain the work that transforms wanting into having. It is a story most high-potential people will recognize in themselves if they are honest about their history. Understanding the neurological reality of focus does not guarantee that you will build better structures, but it makes it possible. You cannot architect something you do not understand, and understanding that distraction is not a moral failure, that motivation is not a reliable system, that willpower is finite and unevenly available, that attentional residue accumulates invisibly and expensively. Understanding all of this transforms the question from, "Why can't I focus?" to, "What structures do I need to build so that focus becomes the natural state rather than the effortful exception?" That is the right question. And now we are ready to begin answering it. The architecture metaphor. Every meaningful structure begins with a metaphor. Before you can build something, you need to be able to see it, not the finished product. That comes later. The mental model, the way of organizing all the pieces so that the work makes sense before it begins, so that each decision has a framework within which to be evaluated, so that you never lose the whole while working on a part. My father used to say that the most expensive mistakes in construction happen in the mind before they happen in the material. A wall built in the wrong place costs you money and time when you take it down. A wall imagined in the wrong place costs you nothing if you catch it before the first nail goes in. The mental model, when it is accurate, is the cheapest and most powerful tool in the entire workflow. I want to offer you the mental model that organized everything for me, the one that made all the other pieces, the neuroscience, the habit research, the environmental design principles, the daily rituals, cohere into a single system. It is the model of mental architecture, and I'm going to build it out in enough detail that you can hold it in your mind the way my father held his buildings, so that when a wall threatens to fall, you know immediately which wall it is, what it is, connected to, and what you need to do. A building has 4 essential structural components. It has a foundation, which is what everything rests on. It has load-bearing walls, which carry the weight of the structure above. It has the interior design, which determines how the space is used on a daily basis. And it has the maintenance systems, electrical, plumbing, ventilation, which keep the building functional over time. Remove any one of these, and the building either collapses immediately or degrades until it does. Mental architecture has the same 4 components. The foundation is clarity, specifically, clarity about what you are building and why. Without this, everything built above it is structurally compromised because it has no stable base to rest on. The load-bearing walls are the disciplines of refusal, the commitments to what you will not do, what you will not allow into your attentional space, what you will not sacrifice at the altar of urgency or social pressure or momentary desire. The interior design is your daily operational system, the rituals, routines, and environmental arrangements that determine how your attention is deployed hour by hour. And the maintenance systems are the resilience protocols, the practices and frameworks that detect damage early, prevent small failures from becoming structural collapses, and return the building to full function after the inevitable disruptions of a real life. Let me develop each of these in turn, because even in this introductory framework, the level of specificity matters. The devil, and the architecture, is always in the details. The foundation, clarity, is the piece that most people get wrong in the most fundamental way. They mistake clarity about goals for clarity about purpose. These are different things at different levels of depth, and confusing them is the reason so many disciplined people work very hard toward destinations that leave them feeling empty. Goals are the rooms you are building. Purpose is the kind of building you are trying to create. A person can have extremely clear goals. I want to earn this much money, I want to reach this title, I want to build this company to this size, and still be working without a real foundation if those goals are not rooted in a clear understanding of what kind of life, what kind of identity, what kind of contribution they are actually trying to build. When the goals and the deeper purpose are aligned, there is a structural integrity to the motivation that makes discipline feel different. Not easy, never easy, but coherent. Like the effort is actually building something rather than just generating activity. The most revealing question you can ask yourself at the foundation level is not, what do I want to achieve? It is, what am I actually building, and who am I building it for? The first question is about output. The second is about architecture. The first question gets answered by setting goals. The second question gets answered by doing the harder work of self-examination that most productivity systems skip entirely, because self-examination is not scalable and cannot be sold as a subscription service, so the industry ignores it. I will tell you more about the foundation, much more, in the next chapter. It is where we begin the actual construction, but I want to make sure you understand the architectural relationship before we go deeper. The foundation is not where you spend most of your time. It is where you spend the right time. You do not rebuild the foundation of a house every morning. You pour it once, carefully, with the right materials in the right configuration, and then you build on top of it with confidence, because you know what is holding everything up. The investment in foundational clarity is front-loaded. The return on that investment compounds over years. The load-bearing walls, the disciplines of refusal, are where most people's mental architecture fails first. Because we live in a culture that treats commitment as addition rather than subtraction. We are taught to say yes to opportunity, to stay open, to keep all the doors, to hedge, to not close off options prematurely. This cultural programming is the enemy of structural integrity. A building with no walls is not an open, free space. It is a slab with a roof balanced on nothing. The walls do not limit the building. They are what make the building possible. Every yes you say to something that is not aligned with what you are building is a no to something that is. Every distraction you allow is a structural compromise. Every commitment you make casually is a load you add without calculating whether the walls can carry it. The discipline of refusal, the deliberate, systematic practice of protecting your attentional resources by clearly defining what you will and will not engage with, is not rigidity. It is load management. It is the practice of knowing what your structure is built to carry and refusing, with genuine respect for the work, to overload it. The interior design, your daily operational system, is where most productivity books spend all their time because it is the most visible and most actionable layer. This is where we talk about morning rituals and time blocking and deep work protocols and the arrangement of your physical workspace. This layer matters enormously, but it only works if the foundation and the walls are in place. The most sophisticated daily system, built on unclear purpose and eroded by constant distraction, will produce exactly what a beautiful kitchen installed on an unstable foundation produces: a nice-looking disaster that collapses when tested. This is why so many people consume productivity content endlessly without ever becoming more productive. They are constantly rearranging the interior design of a house with no foundation and no walls. They try a new morning routine. It works for a week. Then life pressure intrudes and the routine collapses. They try time blocking. It works beautifully on paper. Then an unexpected obligation fills the blocked time and the system falls apart. They try a new app, a new journal, a new method. Each one temporarily substitutes enthusiasm for architecture. And then the enthusiasm runs out, as it always does, and they are back to the slab with no walls and no purpose, wondering why nothing sticks. The interior design works sustainably, compoundingly over years, when it is built on a foundation of clear purpose and enclosed by walls of genuine disciplined refusal. Then, and only then, does the daily system do what it promises. Then the morning ritual is not a performance. It is the maintenance of a real structure that you are genuinely invested in maintaining because you understand what it is holding up. The maintenance systems, the resilience protocols, are the piece that separates amateurs from professionals. Not because amateurs do not know they need them, because amateurs believe they should not need them. Amateurs think that if you build the right system, if you have enough discipline, if you are committed enough, you should not need to recover. You should not falter. You should not have bad weeks or bad months where the whole structure seems to be shaking. The professional knows otherwise. The professional knows that every structure, no matter how well built, requires maintenance. That the question is not whether the pipes will corrode, but whether you have the protocols in place to catch the corrosion early. That the question is not whether life will disrupt your system, but whether you have designed your system with disruption already accounted for. When I talk about resilience protocols, I am not talking about inspirational self-talk. I am not talking about motivating yourself back into action after a setback. I am talking about concrete, specific, pre-designed responses to the failure modes that are predictable, because every architectural system has predictable failure modes. The contractor builds fire exits not because he expects a fire, but because he knows that the cost of designing for failure is always less than the cost of experiencing it without preparation. You should know in advance what you will do when you miss a week of exercise, when a crisis consumes your planned deep work time, when grief or illness or upheaval removes you from your system for an extended period. These things will happen. The resilience protocols are the systems you design in calm moments to carry you through the storms, not by preventing the storm, but by ensuring that when the storm passes, you can return to the structure without having to rebuild from scratch. Together, these four components, foundation, walls, interior design, maintenance systems, form the mental architecture that makes unshakable discipline and focus not just possible, but natural. Not easy in the sense of effortless, natural in the sense of coherent, in the sense that the work flows from the structure rather than fighting against the absence of one. Over the next several chapters, We are going to build each component in detail. We are going to start with the foundation, which requires an honest and often uncomfortable excavation. We are going to build the walls, which requires a clarity about values and priorities that many people avoid, because it means admitting that they cannot have everything and still be excellent at something. We are going to design the interior, which requires specificity and experimentation and a willingness to personalize rather than copy. And we are going to build the maintenance systems, which requires a level of self-honesty about your own failure patterns that is the most uncomfortable and most essential work of all. This is a construction project, the most important one of your life. And like all construction projects, the work will be uneven, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally surprising in ways that reveal things about the terrain that you could not have known from the blueprints alone. That is not failure. That is building. Real building, in real material, in real conditions. Let us begin with the ground. The foundation, clarity, before action. Before my father poured a single cubic yard of concrete, he did something that most people outside the construction industry never think about. He tested the soil. Not because the ground looked unstable. It usually did not. The problem with soil instability is that it is invisible on the surface. You can walk across ground that looks perfectly solid, packed, dry, flat, and be entirely wrong about what is happening 3 feet down. Clay soil, for instance, expands when wet and contracts when dry. Build on it without accounting for that movement and your foundation will crack. Not all at once. Slowly. The cracks begin small, and then they grow, and one morning you wake up and the windows do not close right and the floors are uneven and the wall that was straight is no longer straight, and you trace all of it back to the soil you never tested. The equivalent of soil testing in mental architecture is what I call the clarity audit. Before you build anything else, before you design your morning routine or your work structure or your system for managing attention, you need to understand what you are actually building on, what is actually driving you, what the real motivation is, underneath the stated one. Because the stated motivation, the thing you tell yourself and other people, is almost always a layer or two above the actual foundation. And if you build on the stated motivation without examining what is underneath it, you will eventually find that the structure moves in ways you did not anticipate, that commitments that felt unshakable under certain conditions dissolve completely under different ones, that the discipline you built around a goal you thought you wanted erodes the moment that goal stops feeling relevant to who you actually are. There is a question I use at the beginning of any serious work engagement, and it has a way of making people uncomfortable because it cuts below the level where most goal-setting conversations happen. The question is this: if you achieved exactly what you say you want to achieve, and it looked exactly like you say you want it to look, and the world around you responded to it exactly as you hope it would your life feel like the one you actually want to be living? Most people, when they sit with this question honestly, discover a gap. Not between what they want and what they have. That gap is obvious and is why they are doing goal-setting work in the first place. The gap I am pointing to is subtler. It is the gap between what they say they want and what they actually want at the level of lived experience, at the level of daily texture and moment-to-moment sensation, at the level of identity. A person can want to build a large company and, simultaneously at a deeper level, want the intimacy and autonomy of small creative work. A person can want the external markers of success, the title, the income, the recognition, and simultaneously, at a deeper level, want to be known for something that cannot be measured in those metrics. A person can want to be disciplined and focused and productive, and simultaneously, at a deeper level, be terrified of what will be revealed if all the busyness is removed and they are left alone with the work itself. None of these gaps are character flaws. They are human complexity. The problem is when you build your discipline architecture on the stated goal without examining whether it is aligned with the deeper one. Because when those two are misaligned, the structure will always fight itself. You will exercise discipline in the service of a goal that does not actually fulfill you, and the discipline will feel like deprivation rather than investment. You will wonder why the accomplishment of the thing you worked so hard for felt so hollow, why the promotion you drove yourself toward felt less satisfying than you expected, why the company you built gave you anxiety instead of pride. The foundation work is not comfortable. It requires asking yourself questions that your habitual self-narrative will try to avoid. It requires distinguishing between goals that are genuinely yours and goals that you have inherited from your family, your culture, your professional environment, your comparison with peers. It requires an honest confrontation with the possibility that some of what you are working toward is not actually for you. It is for the version of you that is trying to prove something to someone who may not even be watching anymore. I want to give you a specific framework for doing this excavation. I call it the 3-level clarity map, and it works like this. Take the goal or the work domain you most want to build discipline around. Write it at the top. That is level 1, the stated objective. What you have told yourself you want. Now ask, if I achieve this, what does it give me that I do not currently have? Write that answer below it. That is level 2, the functional value, what the goal is supposed to deliver in practical terms. Now ask again, if I have that functional value, what does it make possible at the level of how I experience my own life? Write that answer below. That is level 3, the experiential core, the thing that is actually driving the desire beneath both the stated goal and its functional rationale. For example, a person says they want to earn $2 million a year. That is level 1. If they examine it honestly, the functional value, level 2, might be freedom from financial anxiety, freedom to make choices without being constrained by money. But if they go to level 3 and ask what that freedom actually makes possible at the experiential level, they might discover that what they really want is the feeling of unhurried time, the ability to be fully present in what they are doing without the background noise of financial pressure. That is a very different thing from money itself, and it has important implications for how they design their life and their work. Here is why this matters for discipline specifically. When your discipline is built on level 1, the stated goal, it is brittle. It holds as long as the goal feels relevant, as long as external validation keeps coming, as long as the circumstances that made the goal feel desirable remain in place. The moment any of those conditions change, the motivation collapses and the discipline goes with it. When your discipline is built on level 3, the experiential core, it is robust, because the experiential core is not dependent on the specific external goal. It survives the inevitable changes in circumstance, the pivots, the setbacks, the evolution of what you want. It is, in the most literal structural sense, a foundation rather than a decoration. My father used to say that a house is only as good as the pour. He meant that the foundation work, the actual pouring of concrete, was the moment when the most important decisions were already behind you. The quality of the preparation determined the quality of the pour. The quality of the pour determined the quality of everything that came after. You could not go back and fix the foundation once the walls were up, not without enormous cost. The time to get it right was before anything else was built. The time to get your clarity right is before you build your discipline system, before you invest months or years of rigorous self-management in the service of a goal that turns out to be sitting on an unstable foundation. The clarity audit is not a one-time exercise. It is a recurring practice. As you grow and change and learn what actually fulfills you versus what you thought would fulfill you, the foundation requires re-examination, not daily. The foundation does not need daily maintenance. It needs periodic, honest attention, an annual revisit at minimum, more often during transitions. I want to address a practical reality here because I know some of you are listening to this and thinking, this sounds like philosophical navel-gazing and I need to get things done today. I understand that instinct. I spent years dismissing this kind of work as unproductive precisely because it did not produce an immediate, visible output. The paradox is that it produces the most important output of all, a coherent self-understanding that makes everything else more effective. The people I have known who were most productively disciplined over the longest periods of time were not the people who were most organized or most rigorous about their systems. They were the people who were most clear about who they were and what they were actually building. The clarity was the foundation. The systems were built on top of it. There is also a subtler benefit to the foundation work that I want to name explicitly, because it took me years to notice it myself. When your discipline is built on genuine clarity, when you know exactly why you are doing the hard thing, and that reason is rooted in your authentic experience of what constitutes a good life for you, the discipline feels different from the inside. It does not feel like deprivation. It does not feel like grinding. It feels like care, like the investment of a craftsperson who understands exactly what they are making and why each step matters to the final product. That feeling is not the same as enjoyment. It is not the same as everything being easy. It is a felt sense of structural coherence, the experience of effort that is genuinely aligned with the direction of your life. And that experience is self-sustaining in a way that motivation based on external goals never is. I am going to leave you with an assignment before we move forward. Not a journaling prompt, though. Journaling is one effective method of doing this, an invitation to genuine examination. In the next 24 hours before you continue to the next chapter, find 30 minutes of uninterrupted quiet. No phone, no background noise, no other task competing for your attention. And sit with this question, not write an answer to it. Sit with it. Let it surface what it surfaces without editing or explaining or justifying. The question is, what am I actually building, and what would it mean to have built it? Not what you want to accomplish, what you want to have built when you look back on this period of your life. Not the goals, but the meaning you want those goals to have made. That is the soil you are building on. That is what the foundation needs to hold. Everything else, the walls, the daily systems, the resilience protocols, everything else is built on that answer. Pour it carefully. The first wall, the discipline of refusal. There is a word that the most focused people I have ever known use more than any other single word. No, not as aggression, not as indifference, as architecture, as the most fundamental load-bearing material in the structure of a disciplined life. I want to spend real time here, because the discipline of refusal is the most consistently underestimated component of mental architecture, and its absence is the most common reason that people who have done the foundation work, who have genuine clarity about what they are building, still find their structures collapsing under weight they never intended to carry. We live in a culture that has romanticized availability, being responsive, being open, being the person who says yes to everything and figures it out. There is a version of this that is genuinely admirable, the willingness to take on challenges, to not close off opportunities prematurely, to stay in the game even when the conditions are hard. But that version has been distorted almost beyond recognition in the modern professional environment into something that is structurally destructive, into the idea that saying yes to everything is a virtue, that being reachable at all times is a form of dedication, that having no clear boundaries around your attention is the same as having no ego, no selfishness, no laziness. It is not. It is the same as having no walls. And a building with no walls is not a building. It is a floor. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of your deliberate self-regulation and long-term decision-making, has a specific vulnerability that is critical to understand here. It is highly susceptible to what psychologists call the present bias, the cognitive tendency to overweight immediate rewards and underweight future ones. This bias is not random. It is systematic and predictable. When someone asks you to take on a new commitment, a new project, a new meeting cadence, a new responsibility, your brain evaluates the proposal with two competing signals. One signal comes from the long-term planning, functions of the prefrontal cortex, which can project forward and recognize that this new commitment will cost attention that you need for your actual priorities. The other signal comes from the social and emotional systems of the brain, which respond to the immediate warmth of being needed, the immediate discomfort of disappointing someone, and the immediate appeal of the new and interesting. In the moment of the request, the social and emotional signals almost always win. The future cost is abstract. The immediate feeling is real. This is why high-performing people systematically overcommit, not because they are bad at planning, because their brain's immediate emotional response to commitment requests is miscalibrated for the long-term reality of their attention budget. They say yes with genuine intention, fully believing they will find the time, fully meaning to deliver on the commitment. And then the future arrives, and the time is not there because it was never there to begin with. It was already promised to the things they needed it for, the things that actually constitute the building they are trying to construct. The discipline of refusal is the practice of correcting for this bias at a structural level, not by becoming cold or closed or ungenerous, by building clear, pre-committed criteria for what your attention is available for, so that in the moment of a request, when your emotional systems are most likely to override your long-term judgment, you already have an answer that does not require in-the-moment deliberation. This is a concept borrowed from the philosopher Derek Parfit's work on personal identity, translated into practical terms. Parfit argued that our future self is, in an important sense, a different person than our present self. We make commitments from a position of relative freedom, and we keep them from a position of constraint. The self that made the commitment had options. The self that must keep it is bound by those options, already chosen. Treating your future self with the same seriousness that you would treat another person, someone whose time and energy and cognitive resources you would not casually exhaust, is the beginning of the discipline of refusal. When you understand this, saying no is no longer a selfish act. It is an act of stewardship. You are stewarding the resources of your future self, who cannot advocate for themselves in the present moment because they are not here yet. Every unnecessary yes you agreed to today is something your future self will have to carry. Every wall you fail to build today is a vulnerability your future self will have to defend when they are tired and depleted and the wind is picking up. I want to give you a concrete decision framework that I use and that I have taught to dozens of people with consistently useful results. I call it the clear-eyed yes test, and it has 3 components. Before agreeing to any significant commitment of your time or attention, you apply all 3. The first component is alignment. Does this commitment serve the thing I am actually building, at the level of foundational purpose rather than surface goal? Not does it sound interesting, not does it have potential value somewhere down the line, not does it serve someone I want to help, but does it directly serve the thing that sits at the heart of the clarity audit I did when I built my foundation? If the answer is no, or honestly uncertain, that is information. The second component is capacity. If I add this commitment to my current load, what specifically does it displace? Not in theory. Specifically, which hour does it take from which other work? Which deep work block does it fragment? Which recovery time does it consume? The answer to this question must be concrete. I'll find the time is not an answer. It is a deferral of the question to your future self, who will not thank you for it. The third component is what I call the full cost accounting. What is the total cost of this commitment, including the attentional residue it will generate, the ongoing coordination it requires, the follow-up it creates, the mental bandwidth it will occupy even when you are nominally working on something else? Almost every commitment costs more than its face value when you account for the invisible overhead. A 30-minute meeting is not 30 minutes. It is the preparation time, the transition time, the processing time afterward, the attentional residue it leaves, in the deep work sessions adjacent to it. A new project that adds 5 hours per week to your schedule does not cost 5 hours per week. It costs 5 hours plus the overhead of managing another active project, the switching costs between it and your other work, and the ambient planning attention it consumes even when you are not working on it directly. When you apply all 3 components honestly, most commitments that seemed reasonable when someone asked you about them reveal themselves as significant structural compromises, and that revelation, uncomfortable as it is the information you need to make a genuinely good decision rather than an emotionally appealing one. There is a category of no that deserves its own treatment, because it is the hardest kind and the most important kind. The no to things that are actually good, not the no to obvious time wasters or clearly unaligned opportunities. The no to genuinely valuable things, interesting projects, meaningful relationships, important causes that are not the thing you are building right now. This is the no that defines a career, the no that separates people who are broadly engaged and occasionally excellent from people who are narrowly focused and consistently exceptional. Warren Buffett has been quoted as saying that the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. This is not a statement about introversion or misanthropy or a lack of appreciation for the richness of life. It is a structural statement about load-bearing capacity. The wall that is designed to carry a specific load cannot carry everything you might want to put on it. Its strength is a function of its design, and its design was made with specific loads in mind. Adding loads it was not designed for does not make the wall stronger. It makes it fail. The no to good things is what protects the space for the great thing, and the great thing is always the thing that required concentrated, sustained, exclusive attention, the thing that could not have been built during the margins, the thing that required someone to look at the whole landscape of their available attention, identify what mattered most, and ruthlessly, lovingly, architecturally protect that thing from everything else. I need to tell you about a choice I made in the 3rd year of building my business. A collaboration opportunity came in that was genuinely exciting. A partnership with a person I respected, in a market I was curious about, for a product that had real potential. Everything about it was legitimately good. My advisor at the time thought I should pursue it. Several people who knew the space well thought the timing was right. On any objective measure, it was a yes. I said no, not because the opportunity was bad, because I ran the 3-part test and discovered that taking it would require me to fragment the concentrated attention I had. Finally, started directing toward the thing I was actually building. My core work was just beginning to gain real traction, the kind of traction that requires sustained presence to convert from early momentum into durable foundation. The collaboration would have pulled me sideways at the exact moment when going deeper was the only thing that mattered. It was a yes disguised as a yes, which is the most dangerous kind. The no to it was the decision that, more than almost any other, determined the subsequent trajectory of what I built. The discipline of refusal is not a permanent posture. It is a contextual one. There are seasons of building when the walls need to be high and the gates need to be narrow, and there are seasons of expansion when you open the structure more deliberately to new input and new connection. The skill is knowing which season you are in and designing accordingly. But for most people reading this, people in the middle of building something serious and important, the season is more likely one that requires walls than one that requires open fields. The urgency of building calls for the protection of concentrated attention, and concentrated attention is only possible when it has been genuinely defended. Before we move from the walls to the interior design, I want to address the emotional dimension of this practice, because the discipline of refusal is not just cognitively challenging. It is socially and emotionally loaded in ways that deserve direct acknowledgement. Saying no to people is hard, not as a matter of logistics but as a matter of identity and relationship. Most of us were raised in environments that rewarded helpfulness and availability. We learned early that being generous with our time and attention was a way of demonstrating our value to others. We learned that saying no risked disappointing people whose approval we needed. We internalized, in ways we often do not consciously recognize, the equation between giving access to our time and being a good person. Declining a request can feel like a moral failure, like selfishness, like cold indifference to someone else's needs. I want to offer a reframe that has genuinely changed how I relate to this discomfort. The most valuable thing you can contribute to anyone, a colleague, a client, a loved one, the world, is your best work, not your availability, your best work. And your best work is only possible when you have protected the conditions that make it possible. When you say no to a request in order to protect the concentrated attention that your most important work requires, you are not failing the person making the request. You are serving the people and the purposes that your best work ultimately reaches. You are choosing between a small contribution made from a depleted, fragmented state and a large contribution made from a focused, architecturally sound one. Understood correctly, the discipline of refusal is not selfishness. It is the highest form of commitment to the work that matters. This does not make the emotional difficulty disappear. The discomfort of disappointing someone is real and should not be dismissed, but it can be held differently, not as evidence that you are doing something wrong, but as the friction cost of doing something right. The friction confirms that you are making a genuine choice, not taking an easy path. The friction is the price of structure, and structure, the kind that holds over years and under real pressure, is never free. Attention is a muscle. There is a moment in the training of every serious athlete when they realize that what they thought was a physical limitation is actually a neurological one. The runner who cannot seem to break a time barrier is not being stopped by their muscles. Their muscles are capable. What is stopping them is the way their brain interprets the signals of exertion, the way the nervous system learns, through repeated experience, what level of output is normal and what level constitutes a genuine threat requiring shutdown. The brain's job is not to maximize performance, its job is to keep you alive. And keeping you alive sometimes means pulling back before your actual physical limit is reached, because the margin of safety is not zero. The body that pushes to true physiological failure is a body that cannot be safely maintained. The same dynamic governs attention. The limit you hit when you try to focus for extended periods is not primarily a metabolic limit. It is a learned neurological limit, a pattern of response that your attentional system has established based on its history of training. Most people's brains have learned through years of reinforced experience that focused attention is something that lasts for about 20 minutes before being rewarded with a break, a dopamine hit, a check of the phone. The brain has been trained, not through deliberate design but through accumulated habit, to expect relief from focus at regular, short intervals. When you sit down and try to extend focus beyond those intervals, the brain's trained response is to generate discomfort, distraction urgency, and the felt need for relief. That discomfort is real, but it is not the signal of a genuine limit. It is the signal of a trained expectation being frustrated. This means that attention is trainable in the same way that physical endurance is trainable, not by pushing through the discomfort once and expecting it to disappear, by systematically, progressively expanding the duration and intensity of focused effort over time, with enough recovery built in to allow for genuine adaptation. This is the principle of progressive overload applied to cognitive work, and it is one of the most practically important ideas in this entire audiobook. The neuroscience here is grounded in what we know about neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself in response to repeated patterns of activation. Every time you sustain focused attention, through the initial wave of distraction urge, you are reinforcing the neural pathways associated with sustained focus and weakening the neural pathways associated with giving in to that urge. The brain literally restructures itself in response to how you use it. The person who trains their attention consistently, who deliberately practices extended focus, who resists distraction repeatedly, who builds the habit of concentration the same way an athlete builds the habit of physical training, develops a literally different attentional architecture than the person who does not. But here is the nuance that most discussions of this topic miss entirely. The training of attention is not simply a matter of forcing yourself to focus longer. That approach fails for the same reason that forcing yourself to run further than you are ready for fails. It produces injury, rather than adaptation. The training must be structured. It must include genuine recovery. It must progress gradually in accordance with your current capacity rather than with your aspirational capacity. And it must distinguish between the productive discomfort of genuine training and the counterproductive strain of overextension. Let me give you the actual framework for training your attention, because the principle without the practice is architecture without materials. You begin with an honest assessment of your current focused attention capacity, not your theoretical maximum on a perfect day with everything aligned. Your actual, repeatable, sustainable current capacity. For most people who have been living in a high distraction environment for years, this number is lower than they expect. It might be 15 minutes of genuinely undistracted concentration before the pull toward distraction becomes overwhelming. It might be 25. For some, it is less. Whatever it is, that is your starting point. That is the current load capacity of the wall you are working with, and like any structural element, you build its strength gradually, not by immediately loading it with what you wish it could carry, but by progressively increasing the load it is currently handling. The protocol works in cycles. You identify your current reliable focus duration, the duration at which you can work with genuine concentration consistently, not occasionally. You work in blocks of that duration, full concentration, phone away, notifications off, environment designed for the single task. You follow each block with a genuine recovery period, not a semi-distracted check of everything you avoided, but a real low-stimulation break. Walk without your phone. Sit with a drink without a screen. Let the brain idle in default mode. This recovery period is not optional. It is the adaptation interval. It is when the brain consolidates the training. After 2 to 3 weeks of consistent practice at a given duration, you extend the block by 5 minutes. Just 5. The increment is small enough to be physiologically achievable and neurologically significant. Over the course of months, these small increments compound. The person who could reliably focus for 20 minutes at the beginning of the year can reliably focus for 90 minutes by the end of it, not through heroic will, but through the same progressive accumulation that builds every other form of human capacity. There is an important distinction that needs to be made explicit here, because it is frequently confused even by people who are seriously working on their attention. The distinction between shallow focus and deep focus. Shallow focus is the state of being engaged with a task without being fully absorbed by it. You are doing the work. You are not falling off into distraction, but the work is not consuming your full cognitive capacity. Emails, most scheduling tasks, routine communications, simple decisions, these require shallow focus. Deep focus is the state of full cognitive absorption, the prefrontal cortex. Operating at high capacity, working memory engaged, background processes suppressed, the task filling your full attentional field, writing, complex analysis, creative problem solving, learning difficult material. These require deep focus. And deep focus is the state that produces your most important work. It is also the state that is rarest, most effortful to enter, and most easily disrupted once entered. The training protocol I described is specifically about expanding your capacity for deep focus. And one of the most important things to understand about deep focus is that it has a warm-up curve. The brain does not enter deep focus instantly. It transitions through a period of settling, where the default mode network is deactivating, where attentional residue from previous activities is clearing, where the task-positive network is activating. This transition takes time. For most people in the early stages of attention training, this settling period is 10 to 15 minutes, which means that a 25-minute work block produces only 10 to 15 minutes of actual deep focus. The rest is approach and departure. As your training progresses and the neural pathways for sustained focus become more developed, this settling time decreases. The brain enters deep focus more quickly because it has learned the pattern. This is one of the most practically significant benefits of consistent attention training. Not just that you can focus longer, but that you can enter depth faster. Now I want to address something directly that the attention training protocol will surface for almost everyone who takes it seriously. The experience of genuine, extended, undistracted focus, once it becomes accessible, can feel initially disorienting, uncomfortable in a specific way that is different from the discomfort of distraction urge. The best way I can describe it is this: when the noise finally stops, you can hear what the noise was covering. Extended focus is a form of presence. And presence, for people who have spent years in high distraction environments, reveals things that the distraction was successfully keeping at bay. Anxieties that have not been examined, doubts about the work itself, about whether it is good enough, whether it matters, whether you are capable. Emotional states that move faster than conscious awareness, when there is always the next stimulus to pull you forward. In deep focus, these things surface, and surfacing feels initially like a problem. Like the work itself is generating negative feelings, like the discipline is making you more anxious rather than less. This is an extremely common experience, and it is important that you understand it correctly, because misunderstanding it causes people to retreat from the very practice that will resolve it. The distraction was not keeping you productive, it was keeping you comfortable. And comfort and productivity are not the same thing. The anxiety and doubt and unexamined emotion that surface in deep focus have not been created by the focus. They were already there underneath the noise. Focus reveals them. And here is what is important to know. The thing that reveals a problem is never the problem itself. The revealing is the first step of the solving. The attention that surfaces your doubts about the work is the same attention that, applied consistently, will show you how to address those doubts. The focus that makes your anxiety visible is the same focus that, over time, will allow you to examine it clearly enough to work with it. The muscle analogy holds here too. The early soreness of training is not injury, it is adaptation. The discomfort of genuine extended focus in the early stages is not a sign that focus is wrong for you. It is a sign that the muscle is being used in a new way. The response is not to stop. The response is to continue, intelligently, with the right recovery protocols in place, and to understand that the soreness is temporary and the strength is permanent. There is one more dimension of attention training that I want to address before moving to the next chapter, and it is the dimension that is most directly within your control on a daily basis. The management of your attentional inputs, not just the discipline of resisting distraction during focus blocks, but the deliberate design of what you allow into your attentional space across the whole day, because the quality of your attention is not just a function of how well you protect it during work. It is a function of what you have been doing to it for the 16 hours before and after the work. Every piece of information you consume feeds either deep processing or shallow stimulation. Conversations that require genuine listening and real response, books that demand your sustained comprehension, problems that require your real thought. These strengthen the attentional circuits. Infinite scroll, algorithmically optimized content streams, reactive communications that require brief responses. These stimulate the circuits without training them. They create the sensation of engagement without the development of capacity. Over time, a diet of predominantly shallow stimulation does to your attention what a diet of predominantly processed food does to your body, not acute damage, gradual erosion of the capacity for depth. This is not a moralistic argument about screen time. It is an architectural one. If you want to develop the attentional capacity for deep, sustained focus, you need to be intentional about the quality of what you are giving your attention to across the entire day, not just during the protected focus blocks. The reading that demands your real comprehension is training. The podcast that develops your thinking is training. The conversation that requires your genuine presence is training. The passive consumption of optimized content streams is the opposite of training. Both are active choices about how you are developing or eroding your foundational attentional architecture. The muscle is always being trained. The only question is in which direction. The enemy inside, emotional interference. Here is a thing that almost no one talks about in books about discipline and focus, because it is not comfortable to talk about and it does not package well as actionable advice. The biggest obstacle to your sustained focus is not your phone. It is not the open plan office, the notification system, the colleague who stops by your desk, or the algorithmic content stream that knows exactly how to keep you scrolling. These are real obstacles. They deserve the attention they get, but they are not the deepest obstacle. The deepest obstacle is internal. It is the emotional weather of your inner life, and it has a specific way of destroying focus that most people have never clearly examined. Emotional interference is the mechanism by which unprocessed feeling consumes cognitive resources that were supposed to be available for the work. It operates largely below conscious awareness. You sit down to work. The work does not immediately capture you. Your attention drifts inward, not to productive planning or genuine creative exploration, but to the low-frequency hum of something unresolved, a relationship tension, a financial anxiety, a professional insecurity, a grievance, a fear. This hum does not announce itself clearly. It presents as a vague sense of difficulty with the task, as the feeling that the work is harder than it should be, as a pull toward distraction that seems to come from the work's inadequacy rather than from the internal weather it is competing with. The result is that you blame the work for being uninspiring when the work is actually perfectly good. You blame your lack of ability when your ability is perfectly adequate. You blame your motivation when what is actually happening is that your cognitive bandwidth is being partially consumed by emotional processing that is running in the background without your conscious awareness. There is significant research in cognitive psychology supporting this mechanism. Matthew Lieberman's work at UCLA on social cognitive neuroscience has shown that unprocessed emotional experience places demands on the same prefrontal resources that are required for focused work. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in emotional regulation, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in focused cognitive work, draw on overlapping neural resources. This means that active emotional suppression, the common strategy of pushing feelings aside so you can focus, does not free up cognitive capacity. It consumes it. You are doing two things simultaneously, the work and the work of not feeling the thing you are suppressing. Both have a cost. The total cost is higher than doing either one fully. Lisa Feldman Barrett's work on the constructed nature of emotion adds another layer to this. Barrett argues that emotions are not simply things that happen to you. They are active predictions your brain constructs based on prior experience, current physiological state, and the conceptual frameworks you have available for categorizing your inner life. Emotions that are not labeled, not named with sufficient precision, tend to occupy more cognitive real estate than emotions that are recognized and articulated. The rough sensation of feeling bad before you sit down to work is more cognitively expensive than the specific recognition that you are experiencing anxiety about a particular situation, not because the specificity makes the feeling disappear, but because the categorization frees the prefrontal cortex from the work of continuously trying to make sense of an unlabeled internal signal. This is what the psychologist James Pennebaker demonstrated in his extensive research on expressive writing. Participants who wrote about emotionally difficult experiences, specifically who translated unstructured feeling into narrative language, showed measurable improvements in immune function, health outcomes, and cognitive performance. The mechanism was not emotional catharsis in the traditional sense. It was the cognitive liberation that comes from converting a free-floating, resource-consuming emotional signal into a structured, labeled, processed representation. The brain could stop devoting resources to the ambiguous signal and redirect them to the work at hand. What this means practically is, that emotional maintenance is not a soft skill ancillary to serious work. It is a hard requirement for cognitive performance. The person who systematically neglects their emotional processing, who pushes through the unresolved relationship tensions, the unexamined anxieties, the unexpressed frustrations, is not being stoic and productive. They are operating with a hidden tax on every cognitive function they rely on for their most important work. The tax is invisible, which is what makes it so dangerous. You cannot feel the drag directly. You only see its effects in the difficulty of the focus, the quality of the output, the rate at which the work depletes you. I want to give you a practical framework for emotional maintenance that is compatible with serious, ambitious work, not the kind of framework that requires you to become a different kind of person or invest hours daily in introspective practice, but the kind that can be integrated into a working life as a non-negotiable structural element. The framework has 3 components, and I think of them as the daily clear, the weekly drain, and the annual inventory. The daily clear is the practice of taking 5 to 10 minutes at the start of each working day, before opening any work task, before checking any communication, to scan your internal state and name what is there. Not analyze it, not resolve it, name it. The question is simply, what is the emotional weather this morning? Anxiety about the presentation, frustration about the conversation yesterday, a low-grade sadness I cannot quite trace, excitement about the project. Whatever it is, name it with as much precision as you can. The naming is the intervention. Research on affect labeling, the simple act of naming an emotional state in words, shows that it reduces activation in the amygdala, the brain's primary emotional processing center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with focused cognitive work. You are quite literally shifting resources from emotional reactivity to directed thinking by naming what you feel. The naming does not make the feeling go away. The presentation anxiety is still there after you have named it, but it has been processed at a basic level, moved from a free-floating, resource-consuming ambiguity into a defined, labeled experience that your brain can now file. The resources that were occupied by trying to make sense of the vague discomfort are now partially freed. Not entirely. The underlying situation still needs attention, and that attention should be scheduled appropriately. But the acute cognitive tax of the unprocessed, unlabeled state is significantly reduced. The weekly drain is a longer practice, 30 to 60 minutes done at the end of the work week, that I think of as emptying the emotional tank before filling it again. Over the course of a week, dozens of small emotional experiences accumulate that were never fully processed in the moment, because the moment did not allow it. The slight from a colleague that you let slide, the fear about a deadline you pushed through without acknowledging, the guilt about a decision you made and are not sure was right, the resentment about a responsibility that does not feel fairly distributed. These accumulations are small individually. Collectively, they create a level of background emotional noise that degrades the quality of the following week's work if they are not cleared. The weekly drain can take different forms for different people. Journaling is the most research-supported method, not diary-style narration, but the specific kind of reflective writing that asks, what happened this week that I did not fully process? What am I still carrying? What is the clearest account of those experiences that I can give? And what would resolution or acceptance look like? The act of writing converts the accumulated material into processed narrative. The week ends with a genuinely cleaner cognitive state than it would otherwise. For people who do not find writing natural, a conversation with a trusted person serves a similar function, not venting, which tends to amplify rather than process, but the structured telling of the week's emotional experiences with someone who can listen without judgment and reflect back without agenda. Some people use physical activity as the drain, running or swimming or climbing as the container within which the week's emotional material is processed through the body. This works for experiences that are primarily body-held, the tension of stress, the physical manifestation of anxiety. It is less effective for the cognitively complex emotional material that needs to be articulated to be fully processed. The annual inventory is the deepest practice, a deliberate extended engagement with the larger emotional themes of your life that do not surface in the daily or weekly practices because they are too structural, too long-running, or too close to your core identity to be visible at shorter timescales. The unexamined beliefs about your own capability, the grief you have been managing rather than feeling, the fear about the future that you have learned to function around without addressing, the relationship patterns that repeat because you have not been willing to examine their origin. These themes are the deepest sources of emotional interference with sustained focus, because they are not transient states, but structural features of your inner life, the psychological equivalent of the soil conditions you need to test before pouring the foundation. The annual inventory is not something you do alone if you can avoid it. The most useful version of this practice involves a skilled therapist, a particularly wise coach, or at minimum a structured retreat of several days during which the ordinary pace of life is suspended enough to let the deeper material rise. I recognize that this sounds like a significant investment. It is. It is also, in my experience, one of the highest return investments available to a serious person. The cognitive capacity recovered from clearing major emotional blockages is not incremental. It is transformational. The person who has done the annual inventory work, who has genuinely examined and processed the deepest emotional interference in their cognitive life, functions at a measurably different level than the person who has not because they are free from emotion, because their emotional life is not running as an invisible tax on every other cognitive function they depend on. I want to tell you something personal here, because the topic requires it. There was a period of about 2 years during which I was working harder than I ever had, and producing less than I ever had, and I could not understand why. I had good systems. I had clear goals. I had the daily practices in place. I was doing everything that should have been working, and nothing was fully working. The quality of my concentration was compromised in a way I could not trace. The energy I brought to the work was real but somehow not converting into output. I was running at high effort and low yield, and I was beginning to suspect that the problem was something about my intelligence or my capacity, that I had hit some genuine ceiling. What was actually happening was that I had been carrying, without examining, a grief I had not given myself permission to process, a loss that I had filed under handled because I had returned to work quickly and maintained external function. What I had not done was genuinely feel what had happened, or make any real space for the experience to move through me. And that unfelt, unmoved experience was sitting in the middle of my cognitive workspace, consuming resources I needed for the work I kept trying to do on top of it. The recognition of this, and the genuine engagement with the processing of it, did not happen through a productivity system. It happened in therapy, and what followed over the next several months was not just emotional relief. It was a visible, measurable recovery of cognitive capacity. The focus that had felt inaccessible became accessible again, not because anything about my external circumstances changed, because the internal obstacle, the thing I had been trying to work around rather than work through, had finally been engaged with honestly. I share this not to make therapy mandatory, or to suggest that your productivity problems are necessarily emotional in origin. I share it because the relationship between inner life and cognitive function is so systematically underestimated in the conversations we have about discipline and focus that ignoring it entirely feels like a genuine failure of honesty. The enemy inside is real, the emotional interference is real, and the tools for addressing it are not mystical. They are specific, they are evidence-based, and they are as much a part of your mental architecture as any morning routine or work protocol. Designing your environment before designing your day. There is a principle in behavioral economics that is so counterintuitive when you first encounter it that most people resist it, and so obviously true when you have been working with it for a while that you wonder how you ever operated without it. The principle is this: your behavior is far more determined by your environment than by your intentions. This is not a cynical statement about human nature. It is a structural observation about the relationship between context and behavior. The environments you inhabit, physical, digital, social, shape your behavior through a continuous stream of cues, frictions, and defaults that your brain processes largely below conscious awareness. You do not need to consciously decide to eat the cookies if the cookies are on the counter. You do not need to consciously decide to check social media if the app is on the first screen of your phone. You do not need to consciously decide to have a shallow conversation if the only space available to you is a noisy, interruption-rich open office. The environment makes those behaviors easy, low friction, and contextually obvious. And easy, low-friction behaviors happen without requiring the expensive machinery of deliberate choice. This works in both directions, and that is the architectural opportunity. Just as an environment can make undisciplined behavior the path of least resistance, AI, deliberately designed environment can make disciplined behavior the path of least resistance. The goal of environmental design is to make the behaviors that serve your work so environmentally easy, so contextually natural, so structurally supported, that doing them requires less willpower than not doing them. You are not relying on the expensive, depletable machinery of deliberate choice. You are relying on the architecture itself to guide behavior. The research base for this is extensive and comes from multiple disciplines. Kurt Lewin's field theory in psychology established the concept of environmental forces as determinants of behavior decades ago. Thaler and Sunstein's work on nudge theory, the architecture of choice contexts, showed how default options and environmental cues shape decisions at a population level. Brian Wansing's food environment research demonstrated that people eat more from larger bowls and larger plates, not because they made different decisions, but because the environment changed the default. Anne Thorndike's work on cafeteria design showed that rearranging the physical placement of food options without changing what was available, without education, without motivation, produced significant and sustained changes in dietary behavior. The lesson from all of this research is the same. If you want to change behavior consistently, change the environment that produces it. The intention to behave differently is necessary, but not sufficient. The boom. Environmental design is what converts the intention into reliable practice. I want to walk you through the specific dimensions of environmental design that matter most for deep focus and sustained discipline, because the principle without the specifics is still just a principle. The first dimension is physical space. The place where you do your most important work should be as signal consistent as possible, meaning that the physical environment should contain as many cues as possible that say, "This is a place for deep work," and as few cues as possible that say anything else. This matters because of context-dependent memory and behavior, the well-documented phenomenon by which environments function as powerful behavioral cues. The brain learns through repeated association what kinds of activity happen in what kinds of places, and it activates the corresponding behavioral scripts automatically when it re-enters those environments. The person who has never done anything in their home, office except deep work, will find it significantly easier to access deep work there than the person who uses the same space for work, entertainment, social media, and relaxation. The environment has learned what happens there. It prompts accordingly. This is why the design of your primary workspace matters so much more than its aesthetic. The workspace should be, as much as possible, exclusively associated with the behaviors you want to reinforce. If deep-focused work is what happens there, then deep-focused work is what should happen there, consistently, without competing associations muddying the behavioral signal. The phone that stays out of the workspace is not just removing a distraction object. It is preserving the behavioral integrity of the space as a signal for depth. The desk that has only what is needed for the current work on it is not just neat. It is a cue management system. The second dimension is digital architecture. The digital environment is, for most people, the most chaotic and most consequential environmental influence on their attentional behavior. It is also the environment over which they exercise the least deliberate design. Most people's digital environments have been shaped not by their own intentions, but by the accumulated defaults of the apps they have installed, the notification settings they have never examined, and the habits of others who have been given real-time access to their attentional field. A deliberately designed digital environment begins with the recognition that every notification permission you have granted is an invitation for something external to interrupt the flow of your attention at a time not of your choosing. The default setting for most applications is maximum interruption. The responsible architectural setting is minimum interruption during protected hours. This is not about digital minimalism as a lifestyle aesthetic. It is about the recognition that you cannot be the architect of your attention if you have handed the keys to dozens of external applications and platforms that have no interest in your cognitive architecture and every interest in your engagement. The specific design decisions matter. Notifications off during deep work periods, all of them, including text messages from people you love, because the attentional cost of a notification is not limited to the time it takes to read. It includes the transition time out of the deep work state, the residue of the interrupted thought, and the re-entry cost of returning to depth afterward. Research by Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine, has shown that the average time to fully return to a work task after an interruption is over 20 minutes. A 2-second notification carrying a message that requires no response consumes on average 20 minutes of your deep work capacity. The interruption is not the cost. The recovery is the cost. Phone placement is not a trivial design decision. The research by Adrian Ward and colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin showed that the mere presence of a smartphone on a desk, even face down, even silenced, measurably reduced available cognitive capacity compared to having the phone in another room. The brain's habit of checking the phone is so deeply trained that the presence of the phone activates a low-level monitoring process, is it time to check, that consumes attentional resources even when you are not actively using the device. Out of sight, out of cognitive workspace is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological reality. The third dimension is social environment design, the often overlooked question of who has access to you and when. The social environment shapes behavior through expectation, norm, and modeled behavior. If the people around you, colleagues, family members, close friends, have expectations of your availability that are incompatible with your deep work architecture, those expectations will erode your structure as surely as any digital notification, not through malicious intent but through the simple pressure of social norm. In environments where everyone is always responsive, the person who is sometimes unavailable faces ongoing friction, the gentle questioning of their responsiveness, the slight implication of unavailability as indifference, the normative pressure to re-enter the always-on current. Managing the social environment for deep work is not about withdrawing from the people in your life. It is about clearly communicating the structural requirements of your best work and doing so with enough specificity and enough evident investment in the work that the people around you understand it as a serious commitment rather than a preference or a mood. The people who care about you most and who benefit most from your best work will understand if you explain it well, and you explaining it well is itself an act of respect toward them. It treats them as intelligent adults who can adjust their behavior in response to a clear and reasonable request. The alternative, allowing their expectations to be set by your inconsistent availability, produces exactly the environment that makes your architecture impossible to maintain. The fourth dimension of environmental design is temporal, the design of your day's structure before the day begins. This is the bridge between environmental design and daily ritual architecture, and it deserves specific treatment here. Most people design their day reactively. They check what has come in, emails, messages, calendar invitations, and they respond to what is most pressing. This reactive approach guarantees that the day's structure will be determined primarily by other people's priorities rather than their own. It is the temporal equivalent of an open-plan office with no doors and no walls, available to everyone, controlled by no one. The proactive alternative is to design the day in advance, specifically to make the most important decisions about how the day's time will be allocated during moments of high cognitive capacity and calm, not in the rushed, residue-laden moments of the morning, when the reactive mode has already begun. The night before planning session, 15 minutes of clear, undistracted design of the following day's structure, is one of the highest return temporal investments in the entire architecture, not because it is magical, because it moves the decision-making about what matters most to a moment when you can genuinely think clearly about it, and it encodes those decisions into the structure of the day so that they are not available for override when the morning's reactive pressures begin. Within that planned structure, the most important architectural decision is the placement of the deep work block. The deep work block, the period of your day reserved for your most cognitively demanding, highest value work, is the most precious architectural element in your daily design. It must be placed at the peak of your cognitive performance window, protected from all the environmental interference we have discussed, and treated with the same non-negotiable seriousness that a surgeon treats the operating theater. The operating theater is not available for other purposes during a procedure. The deep work block is not available for other purposes during the block. Identifying your personal peak cognitive window is a matter of honest self-observation over several weeks. For most people, it falls within the first 3 to 4 hours after waking, because the prefrontal cortex's capacity for deliberate self-regulation is at its daily peak in the morning and degrades steadily as the day progresses. The decision budget is spent, and attentional residue accumulates. But this is a tendency. not a universal law. Some people, evening chronotypes in particular, have a genuine peak that occurs later in the day. The important thing is to identify yours empirically, through observation of when your best work actually emerges, rather than through adherence to a cultural norm about what productive people do in the morning. What I want you to hold as we move from the environmental design into the architecture of daily ritual is this. The environment is not the context in which you do the work. The environment is part of the work. Designing it is as important as anything you do within it. The architect who designs a building without understanding the loads it will bear is an architect who is creating the conditions for structural failure. The person who tries to build focused, disciplined work habits without designing the environment that supports them is doing the same thing. The intentions are good. The structure is missing. And as we have established from the very first chapter of this audiobook, good intentions without good structure produce exactly the results that have been frustrating you. The environment is yours to design. The question is whether you are designing it with the seriousness the project deserves. The ritual architecture. There is a story about the composer Igor Stravinsky that I have returned to many times over the years, not because it is dramatic or particularly surprising, but because it contains a truth about creative and disciplined work that is so quietly radical that most people pass right over it. Stravinsky composed every day, not when the inspiration came, not when the conditions were right, not when the world was quiet enough or his mood elevated enough or the piece at hand felt receptive enough. Every day, he would sit at the piano at the same time each morning, in the same physical arrangement, and he would work. Some mornings, the music came easily. Most mornings it did not, but the sitting was not conditional on the coming. The ritual was not the preparation for the work. The ritual was the work's beginning, and the beginning was what made everything else possible. When asked about this practice, Stravinsky said something that I want you to hold as the governing principle of this entire chapter. He said that inspiration is not something you wait for. It is something that finds you when you are already working. The practical implication of that sentence is enormous. If you are waiting for the right feeling before you begin the ritual, you have misunderstood the causal relationship between feeling and action. The feeling follows the ritual. The focus follows the beginning. The inspiration follows the showing up. This is not a motivational platitude. It is a description of how the brain actually operates when it has been trained to associate a specific sequence of cues with the cognitive state of deep work. What Stravinsky had built, what every highly productive person has built in one form or another, is a conditioned association between a ritual sequence and a cognitive state. Through repeated pairing, the ritual itself becomes a trigger. The brain learns, when this sequence begins, deep work follows. The transition into focus becomes shorter, smoother, and more reliable, not because the person is more talented or more motivated, but because the neural architecture of the transition has been trained through consistent repetition. The ritual is the on-ramp, and on-ramps that have been used thousands of times are faster than on-ramps you are navigating for the first time. This is the neurological basis for something that practitioners of deep work have known intuitively for centuries. The morning routine is not about warming up. The pre-work ritual is not about getting comfortable. These sequences are active conditioning tools that prepare the brain for a specific cognitive state by presenting it with the same sequence of cues that have preceded that state hundreds of times before. The brain, presented with the cues, begins activating the associated state before the work has formally begun. You sit down at the cleared desk, make the specific drink, close the specific applications, open the specific document, and the brain, recognizing the sequence, begins shifting into depth before you have written the first word. I want to build a complete ritual architecture for you, not as a prescription to follow exactly, but as a structural template to adapt. Because the specific elements of your ritual must be yours. They must be chosen based on your own experience of what creates the conditions for your deepest work. But the architecture of a good ritual has consistent structural features that apply across individual variation. The pre-work ritual has 3 phases. I think of them as the clearing, the narrowing, and the crossing. Together, they take between 10 and 20 minutes, and they reliably produce a different cognitive state at the end than at the beginning. Not because of magic, because of structure. The clearing phase is the intentional transition from whatever preceded your work session. It is the practice of leaving the prior context behind, not through willpower and not through distraction, but through a specific set of actions that signal to your nervous system that one mode is ending and another is beginning. The clearing might be a brief walk, a specific preparation ritual around your workspace, a 5-minute version of the emotional daily clear we discussed earlier, naming what is there in the internal weather, so it can be filed rather than left to float. A short period of deliberate stillness. The content of the clearing matters less than its function, which is to create a genuine boundary between the before and the after. The narrowing phase is the deliberate reduction of attentional scope from the broad field of everything you could work on to the single thing you are about to work on. Most people skip this phase entirely. They finish the clearing and then open their laptop and try to decide what to work on from within the state of low-grade overwhelm that comes from holding too many active concerns at once. The narrowing is a deliberate cognitive act. You choose specifically the single most important thing for this session before the session begins, not the 3 most important things, not the list of everything that needs attention, the one thing, and you write it down, physically specifically, actionably, not work on the project. What specifically will I produce or progress in this session? The narrowing converts the broad territory of work into a single path, and entering the session on a single path is neurologically different from entering it on a wide open field. The single path activates goal-directed attention. The open field activates the surveying mode of the default network. The crossing phase is the final ritual action that marks the actual beginning of the deep work session. It is a consistent, specific signal that the transition is complete and the session has begun. For some people, it is a specific first action, opening the document, writing the date, reading the last paragraph from the previous session to pick up the thread. For others, it is a physical signal, putting in headphones, adjusting the lighting, placing the phone in the drawer. For others, it is a brief, explicit statement of intent, not a prayer or an affirmation, but a clear, concrete articulation of what will be produced in this session and why it matters. The crossing is the moment when the preparation ends and the work begins, making it explicit, giving it a specific action that is always the same, trains the brain to recognize it as the genuine boundary. After the crossing, there is only the work. The post-work ritual is equally important and equally neglected. Most people end their deep work sessions, not by ending them, but by being interrupted from them. The phone, the meeting, the colleague, the hunger, something external breaks the session, and the transition back into ordinary life is not designed, it is imposed. The result is that the deep work state leaks out rather than being properly completed, and the attentional residue of the unfinished cognitive state contaminates the recovery period. A deliberate post-work ritual has 2 functions. First, it creates a genuine psychological closure for the session, a signal to the brain that this mode of operation is complete, that the things left incomplete are accounted for and will be returned to at the specified time, and that the nervous system can genuinely rest, rather than hovering at the edge of work in a half-alert state. The shutdown ritual that Cal Newport describes in his work on deep focus serves exactly this function, a specific sequence of actions that closes out the session, captures everything that needs follow-up, and ends with a verbal or written statement of completion. The brain, which monitors open loops automatically and persistently, is given permission to close the loop. The work is noted, the next step is recorded, the session is complete. This matters because the brain does not automatically release the tension of open work. It maintains it. Bluma-Zygarnik's research from the 1920s demonstrated that incomplete tasks remain more persistently active in working memory than completed ones. The shutdown ritual converts the open loop of the unfinished work into a closed loop of a completed session, with a recorded next step. The second function of the post-work ritual is to initiate genuine recovery, not semi-recovery, where you are nominally doing something, restorative while your mind continues churning over work problems. Genuine recovery, the engagement with activities that actively restore the depleted attentional resources. The neuroscience here is specific. Attention restoration theory, developed by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, identifies the kinds of experiences that most effectively replenish directed attentional capacity. Activities in nature, which engage in voluntary attention, the effortless, low-demand kind, and allow directed attention to genuinely rest. Activities of genuine play that are intrinsically engaging and cognitively lightweight. Physical movement without structured cognitive demand. unhurried social connection with people you genuinely enjoy. The common feature is the absence of directed attentional demand. You are not choosing, not planning, not solving, not managing. You are simply being present in an experience that does not require the expensive machinery you spent the morning operating. Beyond the pre-work and post-work rituals, the complete ritual architecture includes what I think of as the anchoring practices, the recurring daily structures that maintain the overall system's coherence across the variability of individual sessions. The anchoring practices are not about deep work specifically. They are about the conditions that make deep work possible day after day, week after week. Sleep is the most powerful anchoring practice available to you, and it is the one most aggressively sacrificed in achievement culture. The research on sleep and cognitive function is unambiguous and the implications are serious. Matthew Walker's extensive work on sleep science has established that sleep is not a passive state of rest, but an active neurobiological process that performs functions critical to cognitive performance, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, metabolic clearance of toxins, including the amyloid beta, associated with Alzheimer's disease, and the maintenance of prefrontal cortical function. The prefrontal cortex, the region most critical for the disciplined, focused, goal-directed behavior we are working to build, is exquisitely sensitive to sleep deprivation. A single night of reduced sleep measurably impairs the very cognitive functions that mental architecture depends on, and the chronic sleep restriction that most high achievers maintain, treating 6 hours as adequate when the research is clear that most adults need between 7 and 9, produces a level of cognitive impairment that is both significant and genuinely invisible to the person experiencing it. You cannot accurately assess your own cognitive impairment when the impairment itself affects the assessment. The person who sleeps 8 hours and uses 6 for deep focused work will produce more and better than the person who sleeps 6 hours and uses 8 for unfocused, impaired work. This is not a theoretical claim. It is supported by research on the relationship between sleep quality and cognitive output across multiple domains, and it runs directly counter to the cultural mythology that equates sleep reduction with dedication. Sleep reduction is not dedication. It is self-sabotage wearing the costume of discipline. Movement is the second anchoring practice, and its cognitive benefits are direct enough that treating it as optional is a meaningful architectural mistake. John Ratey's work at Harvard Medical School on the relationship between aerobic exercise and brain function established that physical movement increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein responsible for neuronal growth, maintenance, and the plasticity that underlies learning. Exercise does not just produce a temporary improvement in mood and energy. It changes the brain's physical structure in ways that enhance the cognitive capacities most relevant to sustained, focused work. Regular aerobic movement is, in the most literal sense, a structural investment in the brain that makes mental architecture possible. The specific form of movement matters less than its regularity and its intensity. 20 to 40 minutes of aerobic activity, the kind that meaningfully elevates heart rate, 3 to 5 times per week produces measurable cognitive benefits that accumulate over time. Walking, when it is brisk enough to qualify as aerobic, is sufficient. Running, swimming, cycling, all equally effective. The key is consistency rather than heroism. 40 minutes 3 times per week, maintained for years, is architecturally more valuable than intense training maintained for 6 weeks and abandoned. The anchoring practices are not about performance. They are about the steady maintenance of the conditions that make performance possible. Nutrition and its relationship to cognitive function is an area where the popular discourse has generated enormous noise around relatively simple signal. The signal is this: your brain is metabolically expensive. It runs on glucose, and the stability and quality of that fuel supply affects cognitive function in ways that are both measurable and significant. Eating patterns that produce stable blood glucose, with protein and fat as consistent components of meals, without large simple carbohydrate loads that produce the insulin spike and crash cycle, provide a more stable cognitive operating environment than eating patterns that do not. The specific details of optimal nutrition for cognitive performance vary based on individual factors, but the architectural principle is consistent. Treat what you eat as part of your operational infrastructure, not as an afterthought or a reward, and design your eating around the demands of your work schedule rather than around convenience or habit alone. None of these anchoring practices are new information. Sleep, Movement and nutrition are the oldest advice in the history of human performance. What is almost always missing is the architectural understanding, the recognition that these are not optional lifestyle choices but structural requirements for the cognitive system you are trying to build and maintain. A building with a cracked foundation and damaged load-bearing walls is not fixed by excellent interior design. A cognitive system depleted by chronic sleep restriction and sedentary behavior is not fixed by a better morning routine. The ritual architecture works because it creates predictability, not the rigid predictability of a life with no variation or spontaneity, but the structural predictability of a system that knows what it is doing and why, that has allocated its resources deliberately rather than reactively, and that has embedded its most important behaviors in physical, temporal, and cognitive cues that make them the default rather than the exception. When your deep work is anchored by a clear pre-work ritual, supported by genuine sleep, fueled by stable nutrition, and restored by real post-work recovery, the system is not fragile. It sustains under pressure. It returns to function after disruption. It produces day after day and year after year the kind of accumulated output that changes the trajectory of a life. When the system breaks, resilience protocols. Everything you have built will break. Not might break, will break. And the sooner you accept that with genuine equanimity rather than reluctant resignation, the better architect you will become. Because the acceptance of breakage is not a concession of defeat, it is the prerequisite for designing structures that can be repaired. The most common failure mode in discipline systems is not the dramatic collapse. It is the gradual abandonment that follows the first significant breach. A person builds a genuine system, a real, functioning mental architecture with working rituals and protecting walls and a solid foundation. Then life applies pressure, a family illness, a professional crisis, a period of grief, a move to a new city, a relationship ending or beginning. The system designed for ordinary conditions bends under the extraordinary load. Days pass without the morning ritual. The deep work blocks disappear into crisis management. The phone comes back out. The boundaries dissolve. And then, and this is where the real damage happens, the person does not return to the system. Not because the system failed them, because they tell themselves a story in which the failure of the system during an extraordinary period represents evidence that the system was never really theirs, that they were not a person who could maintain it, that the system was borrowed clothes that fit for a while and then became uncomfortable when real life showed up. That story is the most expensive lie that disciplined people tell themselves, and it is the primary target of the resilience protocols. A resilience protocol is not a recovery plan for when things go wrong. It is a pre-designed structural response to predictable failure modes. The distinction matters because recovery plans are made after the fact, from a state of depletion and diminished cognitive capacity, under the emotional weight of having failed. Pre-designed structural responses are made in advance, from a state of clarity and full cognitive capacity, from a place of genuine architectural thinking rather than reactive management. The contractor who installs the fire suppression system before the fire is in a categorically different position from the contractor who calls the fire department during one. The first resilience protocol is what I call the minimum viable ritual, the compressed, non-negotiable version of your system that can be maintained under even the most demanding conditions. When you are designing your full ritual architecture, simultaneously design its minimum viable version. This is the irreducible core, the practices that, if nothing else survives, preserve enough structural integrity that returning to the full system is possible rather than requiring a complete rebuild. The minimum viable ritual might be as brief as 10 minutes. It might consist of a single focus block of 25 minutes rather than 90. It might involve a 5-minute journaling entry rather than a full weekly drain. It is not the ideal. It is the floor. And the floor is what prevents the complete collapse of the system during the periods when the ceiling is unavailable. The psychological function of the minimum viable ritual is as important as its practical function. When your system is under maximum pressure and you are running the minimum viable version, you are not failing at your system. You are operating a different mode of your system that was designed for exactly these conditions. This reframing is not cosmetic. It changes the relationship between the person and the practice in a way that makes return to the full version far more likely. The person who maintained the minimum viable ritual through a crisis returns to the full system because there is a continuous thread to return along. The person who abandoned everything because maintaining everything was impossible has nothing to return to. They have to start over, which is a much higher threshold. The second resilience protocol is the re-entry sequence, a specific pre-designed procedure for returning to the full system after a period of absence. Not, "I'll get back on track," which is a statement of intention with no structural content. A specific sequence. On the first day back, do this. On the second day, add this. By the end of the first week, the system should be back at this level. The re-entry sequence acknowledges that returning to full operation after a significant disruption is not a single decision but a process, and it designs that process in advance when you have the clarity to design it well. The reason the re-entry sequence matters is that the moment of return, the first day back after a disruption, is cognitively and emotionally loaded in a specific way. There is the residue of the crisis itself, the depleted emotional resources, the fact that your attentional pathways have been running in a different, lower intensity mode and need recalibration. The subtle but powerful voice of the resistance that says you have lost your momentum, and starting again is harder than continuing. Starting again is not harder than continuing. It feels harder because it is a beginning, and beginnings always feel harder than middles. The re-entry sequence converts the beginning into a middle. It places you in step 3 of a pre-designed process rather than at the terrifying starting line of a blank page. The third resilience protocol is the regular audit, a structured assessment of the system's current state that happens not reactively, in response to failure, but proactively on a regular schedule, monthly or quarterly, depending on the nature of your work and the pace of change in your life. The audit asks, which components of the architecture are functioning as designed, which are showing signs of erosion? Where has gradual drift introduced behaviors that were never deliberate? What has changed in the conditions of my life that the current design does not adequately account for? The regular audit is the structural equivalent of preventive maintenance. Buildings that are maintained proactively, inspected regularly, addressed at the first sign of degradation rather than at the point of failure, last significantly longer and at significantly lower total cost than buildings that are only attended to when something breaks. The same is true for mental architecture. The small adjustments made during a regular audit, a ritual that has drifted and needs resetting, a boundary that has been allowed to erode and needs reinforcing, a foundation element that needs revisiting in light of changed circumstances, are cheap, quick, and effective when made early. Made after the drift has become structural failure, they are expensive, slow, and uncertain. There is a fourth resilience protocol that is more subtle than the others and more important than it might initially appear. I call it the failure narrative. Specifically, the practice of examining, honestly, without excessive self-criticism and without excessive self-protection, the story you tell yourself about why the system broke, because the story you tell about the failure determines almost everything about what you do next. There are 2 common failure narratives, and both of them are structurally damaging. The first is the self-blame narrative. I broke the system because I lack discipline, because I am fundamentally not a person who can maintain this kind of structure, because I am weak, or lazy, or not serious enough. This narrative is destructive because it locates the problem in character rather than in design, and character is much harder to change than design. If the system broke because you are fundamentally flawed, the only solutions involve becoming a different kind of person, an extremely high bar that most people find unachievable because it is the wrong level of analysis. Systems do not fail because of character flaws. They fail because of design flaws, and design flaws are fixable. The second damaging narrative is the externalization narrative. The system broke because of external circumstances that were beyond my control, and the fact that it broke is therefore not something I can learn from or improve. The circumstances were responsible. This narrative is also destructive because it removes the architectural agency that is the foundation of everything we have built. External circumstances are real. They genuinely disrupt systems. But the person who locates the entire explanation of failure in external circumstances has missed the architectural question. Was the system designed to be resilient enough for the conditions it would actually face? The disruption is not the problem. The design's inadequacy for the disruption is the problem. And that is a design problem, which means it has an architectural solution. The useful failure narrative is neither of these. It is the engineering debrief. What specifically broke? Under what conditions? What does that breakdown reveal about the design's current weaknesses? What would need to change in the design, not in the person, to prevent or better manage this specific failure mode in the future? This narrative respects the difficulty of what happened. It does not dismiss the real cost of the disruption. It treats the failure as data, the most expensive and therefore most valuable kind of data, and it uses that data to make the architecture more robust than it was before the break. The person whose system never breaks is not the person with the best system. They are the person whose life has not yet applied enough pressure to reveal the system's weaknesses. Those weaknesses exist. They are simply unexposed. The person whose system has broken and been rebuilt is not weaker than the person whose system has never been tested. They are more architecturally informed. They know where their structure is vulnerable in ways that untested structures cannot know, and that knowledge, applied through the engineering debrief, becomes the material of a more resilient design. Focus at scale, sustaining over months and years. The difference between the person who transforms and the person who merely improves is a function of time horizon. Improvement is the work of weeks and months. Transformation is the work of years. And the architecture that sustains over years is structurally different from the architecture that sustains over months, not because the components are different, but because the relationship between the person and the architecture changes at longer timescales. And that change introduces challenges that shorter timescales never expose. The first challenge of long-term focus is what I call the plateau problem. Progress in any serious endeavor is not linear. It follows a curve that feels from the inside profoundly unfair. There are periods of rapid visible improvement, early in a learning curve, during moments of clarity and breakthrough, when new methods produce dramatic results. And then there are plateaus. Extended periods where the effort continues but the visible progress slows or stops entirely, where you are doing the work at the same quality and the same volume, and producing, apparently, the same results that you produced last month. The plateau is where most long-term projects die, not because the work stops being valuable, because the feedback loop that was sustaining the motivation, the visible improvement, the external validation, the felt sense of forward movement, has temporarily gone quiet. And without that feedback, the investment of sustained, focused effort starts to feel irrational. The mind begins to ask, is the work actually working? Am I doing the right thing? Is this the right approach? Is there a better path I'm missing by staying on this one? These questions are not irrational. They are appropriate. The problem is the timing. They arise with particular force during the plateau, which is also, counterintuitively, the period of greatest actual progress. The plateau in a skill development curve is not a period of no progress. It is a period of consolidation, where the brain is integrating the learning from the previous rapid improvement phase into a stable, reliable foundation that will support the next phase of rapid improvement. You are not standing still. You are building the base for the next climb, but the base building is invisible from the outside and often imperceptible from the inside. Understanding this does not make the plateau comfortable, but it makes it navigable. The person who understands that the plateau is structural, that it is a feature of the learning curve rather than an indication of personal failure or wrong direction, can maintain the discipline of continued engagement through it in a way that the person who interprets it as stagnation cannot. They are not forcing themselves to continue despite evidence that they should stop. They are trusting the architecture during the phase when it is doing its most important invisible work. There is a practical protocol for managing plateaus that I have found consistently useful. It involves shifting the measurement framework temporarily from output to input, during periods when the output, the visible progress, the measurable results, is not providing adequate feedback. Shift your attention to measuring the inputs, the quality and consistency of your practice, the depth of your engagement with the work, the specific dimensions of skill or understanding that are actively developing, even when they are not yet visible in the final output. You are not abandoning outcome orientation. You are supplementing it with process orientation during the period when outcome measurement is failing to capture the actual progress being made. The second challenge of focus at scale is what I call the identity drift problem. Over years, the person who does the work changes. Priorities shift. Values deepen or evolve. What felt like the right direction at 30 may need significant revision at 35. The work that was genuinely aligned with your foundational purpose at the beginning of the project may have become partially misaligned as your understanding of that purpose has matured. This is not failure. This is the natural evolution of a person who is doing serious inner work alongside serious outer work. The problem arises when the external architecture, the goals, the commitments, the professional identity, fails to evolve at the same pace as the internal one. When you are executing a plan whose underlying purpose has shifted without your system acknowledging the shift. The regular audit practice we discussed in the resilience protocols addresses part of this, but at multi-year timescales, the identity drift requires a more thoroughgoing revisit of the foundation itself. Not every year. The foundation does not need annual reconstruction, but every few years, particularly at significant life transitions, the architectural equivalent of a structural inspection by a licensed engineer, rather than just a homeowner walking through the rooms. A genuine, honest, unhurried examination of whether what you are building is still what you actually want to build, whether the purpose that anchored everything still resonates as deeply as it once did, whether the walls you built to protect the work still serve the work, or whether they have become walls that protect a version of the work that you have outgrown. This requires the willingness to change direction even after significant investment, and that willingness is hard, because sunk cost is one of the most powerful cognitive biases in human psychology. The resources already invested, the years of discipline, the relationships built around the work, the public identity associated with the direction, make changing course feel like losing everything you have built. The architectural truth is different. Changing direction from a foundation of genuine clarity and accumulated competence is not starting over. It is extending the building in a new direction from a foundation that already exists. The foundation goes with you. The skills go with you. The character that was developed in the process of sustained, disciplined work goes with you. What changes is the direction of the next phase, and that change, when it comes from honest architectural examination, rather than from plateau discomfort or grass's greener restlessness, is not retreat, it is evolution. The third challenge of focus at scale is maintaining the quality of the practice over time. This is subtler than the previous two and more insidious, because it does not announce itself. It is the slow, largely invisible process by which a genuine practice becomes a habit, and a habit becomes a ritual, and a ritual becomes a performance, and a performance becomes empty motion. The morning routine that was once a genuine act of intentional preparation becomes, over years, something you do automatically without genuine presence. The deep work block that was once a period of true cognitive engagement becomes something you sit through, going through the motions, producing output that looks like your old output, but lacks its depth. The practices are still there. The substance has quietly evacuated. The antidote to this erosion is what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, the deliberate renewal of genuine engagement with practices that have become automatic, not reinventing the practices from scratch but re-inhabiting them with fresh attention, periodically asking, if I were designing this practice for the first time, knowing what I now know about what it is supposed to do, would I design it the same way? What has changed? In my work, my understanding, or my conditions that the current practice design does not account for? What genuine intention was behind this practice when I began, and am I still in contact with that intention when I do it? The renewal of intention is not a one-time act. It is a recurring practice that must be built into the architecture with the same deliberateness as everything else. The monthly or quarterly audit can serve this function if it is designed to include a genuine assessment of qualitative engagement, not just, am I doing the practices, but am I genuinely present in the practices? The answer to the second question requires more honesty than the first, and it is the more important question by far. Sustained focus over years is ultimately not a discipline problem. It is an identity problem, and identity problems have a specific solution that is different from the solutions to discipline problems, habit problems, or motivation problems. They require the continuous work of becoming the kind of person for whom the focused, disciplined life is not a practice to maintain, but a natural expression of who you are. That shift, from doing disciplined work to being a person who does this kind of work as a matter of identity, is what the next chapter is about. It is the deepest architectural work of all, and it is where everything else we have built finally coheres into something that does not need to be maintained because it has become what you are, the identity. Shift. At some point during the sustained practice of mental architecture, something changes. It does not happen on a specific day. It does not arrive with announcement or ceremony. It is more like the change from winter to spring, gradual, irreversible, and recognized only in retrospect when you look back and realize that something that once felt like effort now feels like nature, that something you once had to choose is now simply what you do. This is the identity shift, and it is the destination everything in this book has been building toward, not the system, not the rituals, not the environmental design or the resilience protocols or the emotional maintenance practices. These are the means. The identity shift is the end, because when the identity shift has occurred, the means become self-sustaining. The discipline no longer requires external architecture to maintain it, because it has been internalized at the level of self-concept. You do not maintain focus because you have built good systems. You maintain focus because you are a focused person, and being a focused person is not something you can stop doing any more than you can stop being tall. The concept I am describing draws on a distinction that the psychologist William James made in the late 19th century, and that researchers in behavioral science have refined significantly since. The distinction between behavior change and identity change. Behavior change operates at the level of what you do. Identity change operates at the level of who you are. And the research is consistent that behavior changes anchored in identity are dramatically more durable than behavior changes anchored in willpower, motivation, or external systems alone. The person who quit smoking because their doctor told them to is in a categorically different position from the person who quit smoking because they have adopted the identity of a non-smoker. The first person is a smoker trying not to smoke. The second person is a non-smoker. Same behavior, different architecture, completely different long-term trajectories. The same principle applies to focus and discipline. The person who is disciplined because they have built good systems is in a valuable but ultimately intermediate position. The systems help enormously. They reduce the demand on willpower. They make the disciplined behavior the path of least resistance, but they are still external. They still require maintenance. They are still, in some sense, a structure applied to a self that is not yet fully identified with what the structure requires. And every external structure is vulnerable in a way that a deeply integrated identity is not. The path to identity shift is not a shortcut. It runs directly through all the work we have done in this book. You cannot will yourself into a new identity. You build it, the same way you build the foundation and the walls and the daily rituals, through specific, deliberate, consistently applied action over time. The identity does not precede the practice, it follows from it. Every act of genuine focus, sustained past the point where you would previously have abandoned it, is a vote for the identity of a focused person. Every act of disciplined refusal, every morning ritual completed when it was uncomfortable, every re-entry after a breakdown, every regular audit honestly conducted, each of these is a brick in the identity structure. The identity is built from the outside in, through behavior, and gradually becomes an inside-out reality that generates the behavior automatically. James Clear, building on this insight in his work on habit formation, describes identity as the accumulation of evidence. You do not believe something about yourself because you decided to. You believe it because you have accumulated enough consistent behavioral evidence to make the belief structurally plausible. The first time you maintain your deep work block despite the pull toward distraction, you have one data point. The 100th time you have a pattern. The 1000th time you have an identity. The belief, I am someone who maintains focus under pressure, is not an affirmation. It is a summary of 1,000 consistent behaviors, and it is a summary that changes how you behave in the 1001st instance, because now you are not making a fresh decision about whether to maintain focus. You are simply acting in accordance with who you are. This understanding changes the practical approach to every difficult moment in the discipline practice. When the distraction urge comes and you are deciding whether to resist it, the question is not, do I feel like staying focused right now? It is, what would the person I am becoming do right now? These are not the same question. The first question asks for an honest report on your current emotional state. The second question asks you to act from a future identity that you are in the process of building rather than a current state that is entirely real but not the whole of who you are. The gap between the two, between the current state and the becoming identity, is not hypocrisy. It is growth. You are not pretending to be something you are not. You are building towards something you are in the process of becoming. There is a specific practice that accelerates the identity shift, and it is one of the most powerful and most underused tools in the architecture of self-change. It is the practice of narrating the identity, not in the delusional sense of repeating affirmations that have no behavioral foundation, but in the specific sense of articulating, with precision and genuine conviction, the behavioral evidence that supports the emerging identity. After a week of maintained discipline, not, "I had a good week," but, "I am someone who shows up for the work consistently." After a successful re-entry following a disruption, not, "I got back on track," but, "I am someone who returns to what matters after difficulty." After an act of genuine disciplined refusal, not, "I said no to something," but, "I am someone who protects the work from what doesn't serve it." The narration is not pep talk, it is evidence review. You are explicitly connecting your behavior to your identity, so that the connection, which the brain requires time and repetition to establish, is made more quickly and more firmly. The social dimension of identity shift is also significant and worth acknowledging explicitly. We are social creatures in the deepest neurobiological sense, and our identities are not formed in isolation. They are formed and maintained in the context of the communities and relationships within which we live. The identity of a focused, disciplined person is significantly easier to sustain when it is recognized and reinforced by the people around you. When the people in your immediate environment understand and respect what you are building, model similar commitments themselves, and hold you accountable not through external pressure, but through the shared values of a community that prizes this way of being. This is why the communities you choose to invest in, the professional networks, the personal relationships, the learning communities, are architectural decisions, not just social ones. You are not just choosing who you spend time with. You are choosing whose behavioral norms will gradually influence your own. The environment shapes behavior. The social environment shapes identity. The most powerful identity reinforcement available is to be surrounded by people who already embody the values you are working to make your own, not as models to imitate, but as living demonstrations that the identity you are building is real, achievable, and worth everything the building costs. I want to tell you something that took me years to understand about the identity shift. It is not the end of struggle. The person who has made the identity shift, who genuinely is, not just tries to be, a focused and disciplined person, still faces the distractions, still encounters the difficult mornings, still navigates the periods of depletion and breakdown and plateau. The identity shift does not eliminate the hardness of the work. It changes your relationship to it. The difficulty that once felt like evidence that you were failing at something that other people found easy becomes, after the shift, simply the texture of the work, the weight that lifts, the resistance that confirms you are working against something real, the price of building something that matters. A surgeon does not find surgery easy. They find it within their nature. The effort is fully present. The mastery is also fully present. They are not fighting the difficulty. They are inhabited by the competence to meet it. That is the destination, not the absence of resistance, but the presence of a self that is genuinely equipped to meet it, that has been built, through years of deliberate, architectural work, to be exactly what the difficulty requires, the house that stands. I want to go back to the construction site, not the chaotic one I described at the beginning, the site with no architect, walls going up without connection, energy without structure, ambition without form. A different site, one I recognize now every morning when I sit down to work. The house that stands is not perfect. The contractor who built it, who is still building it, because a good house is always in some state of construction or renovation, knows its weaknesses better than anyone, knows which wall took 3 attempts to get right, knows where the foundation was poured too quickly and had to be reinforced later, knows which rooms were designed for a version of life that has since evolved and which will eventually need reconfiguration, knows the maintenance systems that have occasionally failed and what was learned from each failure. But it stands, not despite the difficulty of the building, because of the deliberateness of it. What changed for me was not the acquisition of a method. It was the acquisition of an understanding. The understanding that the mind's capacity for sustained, powerful, creative, productive focus is not a fixed attribute of personality or genetics or luck. It is a structure, and structures can be built, and the building of structures requires knowledge of materials, understanding of loads, respect for the environment in which the building will stand, and a willingness to do the unglamorous, patient, iterative work of construction that precedes the day when the building is finished enough to be lived in. I want to close by naming what this work has actually been about, underneath all the neuroscience and the frameworks and the protocols. Because the real reason to build mental architecture, the reason that sustains the effort through the plateaus and the breakdowns and the seasons of ordinary difficulty, is not productivity. It is not output, maximization, or competitive advantage, or any of the instrumental framings that the achievement culture offers. The real reason is presence. The focused mind is a present mind, a mind fully here, fully engaged with what is in front of it, fully available to the work and the people and the experience of being alive. Distraction is the enemy not because it reduces output, but because it reduces presence. Every hour spent in the fractured, half-engaged, partially elsewhere state of chronic distraction is an hour spent somewhere that does not actually exist, suspended between the past you are ruminating on and the future you are anxious about, never quite fully in the actual moment of your actual life. The mental architecture we have built together, the foundational clarity, the walls of disciplined refusal, the daily ritual structure, the resilience protocols, the identity shift, all of it serves, ultimately, this one purpose: to make you present for the life you are actually living, to bring the full weight of your intelligence and attention and care to bear on the thing that is in front of you right now, whether that thing is the project that matters most to you, or the person who needs your full attention, or the experience that is happening only once. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh wrote that the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. He was not writing about productivity, he was writing about life, but the architectural truth he was pointing to is the same one we have been building toward throughout this entire journey. A focused mind is not just a more effective mind, it is a more alive mind, a mind that has the structural integrity to be fully where it is, to give what it has, to build what it came here to build. There is a conversation I have with people at the end of every engagement when we have done this work together. I ask them one question, and I want to ask it to you now, at the end of this book. Looking back from where you stand today, one, at the life you have lived, the work you have done, the attention you have brought to the moments that mattered, does it feel like the work of an architect or the work of someone who was always about to begin building? Most people, the first time I ask them, feel the sting of the second option. They recognize themselves in the person who was always planning, always preparing, always finding reasons why this was not quite the right time to begin the real construction. The person who had all the right materials and no structure. But then I ask them the second part. And now, knowing what you know, having built what you have built, having done the work this journey required, what will you build? That question is the one that matters. Not as a motivational close, not as a neat narrative arc, as a genuine structural inquiry. Because the architecture we have built in these pages is not a museum piece. It is a living building, and it goes with you into every moment that follows. Every decision you make from here about how to allocate your attention, what to protect and what to release, how to respond when the system bends and what to do when it breaks. All of it is architectural work. All of it is the ongoing construction of the only house you will ever actually live in. My father used to say when a project was finally complete enough to walk through with genuine pride, a good building knows why it was built. He meant that the best structures are transparent, that their design reveals their purpose, that you can feel the intention in every material decision and every structural choice, that the building is not just standing, it is standing for something. Build a mind that knows why it was built. What you build with it, that is yours. Build it well.